Welcome to my top 10 tips for rapport-based interviewing. 10 tips here based on 25 years of basically being involved in training research on orbit, observing rapport-based interpersonal techniques, and I thought I'd share with you a set of clips basically that we come across time and time again in training, and we find ourselves saying to students many times when we're doing training on police interviewing. So I hope they're helpful, certainly intended to be helpful and usable, and enjoy. So tip 1 is do your psychological homework. We find that an awful lot of police officers, when they're preparing their interviews, spend an awful lot of time on the legal procedures, and quite rightly so. But we always recommend that you should consider who exactly it is that you're dealing with from a psychological point of view. And even if that's as basic as asking two really important questions. First of all, try to establish what the suspect, captured person or detainee was like when they were arrested or first picked up. And also ask what they've been like in custody. We find over and over again when we're running training sessions, those questions aren't asked by police. So do ask those two questions. How has the person been behaving in custody? And how were they when they were arrested? And not infrequently, you will find that that's useful information to take forward into the interview. Tip 2. So tip 2 is what we call sell the caution. We find that a lot of police officers are tempted to or go through the caution in a very robotic, very mechanistic way. I've even seen police officers or heard police officers say, we'll just get through this bit and then we'll get on with the interview. Well, the caution is an important legal process, but as much as anything else, you really need to sell the idea to the person that you're interviewing of its worth and merits, because not only is it important, but the suspect will take it as more important if you are selling it to them as an authentic right that they have and are able to take advantage of. And perhaps counterintuitively, the more you make it clear what their rights are with regard to their right to silence, their permission to talk, the fact that everything's recorded and is on tape, and the more naturalistic and conversational you make that, and the more importantly you highlight it, the better. Now, that's not to say that you deliver the caution tonally in the same way to everyone. Someone that's very intelligent, you may need not to labour it as much. You need to make sure they've understood it, of course. But the key really is that it's not a robotic, mechanistic process. Find ways to deliver it so that it sounds real and that you mean it when you say it, rather than that it's just a piece of admin. So the third thing to consider is what we call, why am I here? Now, we've seen some officers misunderstand the notion of rapport as just having a conversation, and it absolutely is not that. One of the key things that will be on a suspect's mind when you first deal with them is their concerns around whether they're innocent or guilty, or know something or don't know anything at all. What they will want to know more than anything else is why they're there. So you need to establish quickly an answer and a statement about the evidence that you have that puts that person, rather than any other person, in the chair. And actually, if you think about it yourself, if you had been arrested for a murder or a sexual offence or any other crime, the first thing that's going to be at the forefront of your mind is, why am I here? It will not be these kind of very cookie cutter forms of alleged rapport building, like, would you like a cup of tea, or is it too warm or too hot or too cold? Those are all welfare checks, and they may be important, but a really key issue is making sure that you are clear in your mind what it is that you will say in response to what is in the suspect's mind. What is it that puts me in this chair? Tip 4 is what we call opening line. It's surprising the amount of officers that have not fully thought through exactly what their opening line will be after they've delivered the caution. And that might be a question or a statement or whatever. But really, it's the only bit of complete control and predictability that you as an interviewer have, is having control of and being able to rehearse your opening line, the very first words that come out of your mouth. And we know that that influences people's willingness to engage. So do spend some time thinking through and practicing with your second jockey, your second interviewer, or indeed someone else in the team, that very first question, so that you've got it rehearsed and it can just roll off the tip of your tongue in a very clean and organised and clear way. Tip 5, the power of the mouse. Don't underestimate how significant it is for you to adopt a position of humility and listening. In the orbit model, many of you will be familiar with the 4 different archetypes of interpersonal behaviour that we talk about, that are to do with being in control, being in conflict, cooperating with someone and capitulating. And what we found in our research is that the sort of safe go-to area, if you are struggling as an interviewer, is that capitulate zone, which basically means dropping down to a position of listening and humility and quietness. So if you're in the middle of something which is complex or difficult, don't feel afraid to drop down into that place where you are on receive rather than send. Take your time, slow your voice down, and think about what it is that you're going to say. It's much better to formulate a sensible question by considered meaningful cognition and concentration, rather than quickly launch into a question which is inarticulate and not very clear. So do take the time to sit back, properly listen and consider what you're saying. That position of what we call mouse is the single most important position to be in as an interviewer. Two brains are better than one. The other thing that we've noticed is, not infrequently, we see a very good lead interviewer or a good lead interviewer supported by a glorified note taker instead of a second interviewer. And that seems nuts to me. I mean, it's really important that if you are both trained interviewers, you rely on each other more to do the thing that you are both good at, instead of having one simply taking notes. So that second jockey or second interviewer is there to support the lead. So there should be a degree of turn taking between you. Now that often comes with training, but you should have a considered plan about how you're going to manage that, and not simply use your second interviewer just as a note taker. It may well be that it's important for them to take notes, but given that you're both interviewers, you should both be interviewing. One of the things that can be considered here is, if you feel you've got a particularly difficult person to interview, or even if you're not so great at the caution, if you're that lead interviewer, then enable your second interviewer to do the caution bit. And what we sometimes advise here is that if you're in the interview, you'd go into the interview room and you'd say, "My name's Laurence Session, I'm going to be interviewing today. You're also going to be interviewed by David here. And David's going to go through the caution and then he's going to hand back to me, but both of us will be interviewing you." The benefit of having your second jockey deal with the caution is that they can then hand back to you whilst you've been given that time to diagnose exactly the sort of person that you've got in front of you, and give yourself that little bit more headspace. So it's certainly not a rule that we would advocate of always having the second jockey do that introductory or cautionary phase, but it is an option that you must consider. Tip 7, the right to silence and permission to talk. Now, of course, it's very important to clearly convey that for any suspect that you are dealing with, they have an absolute right to silence. But don't think that means that they don't also have a right to talk. So you need to make it very clear that it is up to the person that you are dealing with to make a decision about each and every question. And it is not about the solicitor's advice which that suspect must be taken as an instruction, and nor indeed is it about yours. So if you have a very robust or rigorous solicitor that seems to be instructing their client to be silent, you need to deal with that, because that is not the case. It is the case that they have a right to silence, and it may well be the case that a solicitor has advised that suspect to be silent. But advice is not the same as an instruction. So make it clear that it's up to the person that you are interviewing, and it's not up to you as the interviewer. It's not what you want, but it's also not what the solicitor wants. It's what the individual sat in the chair that is being interviewed wants. And sometimes they may want to speak. So make that clear that that is their right to speak, as well as their right to silence. Tip 8, don't store up the gotcha. So what we sometimes see in our less good interviewers is a perfectly good and acceptable free narrative phase, which is non-judgmental and impartial and objective and professional. And then at a certain point, it's almost like they've, then turn the tables on the suspects and do what we call a gotcha, where they're saving up all the evidence until right at the end, and they haven't picked up any of the discrepancies or any of the things that weren't made clear earlier on in the interview. Now, of course, you need to think about structured use of evidence and not revealing, every piece of evidence, so that they have a chance to give a uncorrupted account, if you like. But nonetheless, there are times when you should be picking up what seem to be inconsistencies or parts of the narrative that don't make sense, and you question them then. And the reason that we advocate that is because if you store everything up and then kind of pull out a aha moment, that suspect will feel that they've been cheated. They will feel that they've been lied to, and they will feel that they've been deceived, and they may well think to themselves, well, why didn't you mention it earlier? If I hadn't made myself clearer earlier, why didn't you mention it then, instead of now bring this to my table as if I've messed up or lied to you or been deceptive? So always consider when you will challenge a piece of the narrative that doesn't make sense to you. And our strong advice is to challenge it in the moment. Don't store everything up until the end. Tip 9, ATFQ. Now, I'm sure you can imagine what that stands for, but certain bits of it are ask the question. The F, I'll leave that to your own discretion and imagination. The frustrating thing that we often see is that rapport is being maintained, and there's a good link between the suspect and the interviewer. Things are going really, really well. And for whatever reason, which I think is almost the fear of breaking that successful interaction, that an interviewer will not ask a completely obvious question. And when you are in the room and the door is open, ask the question, which might be something as obvious as who was your associate and what was their name, what was the mobile phone number of the person that you were speaking to, where did you leave the body, or whatever it is. But the SIO's goals or objectives must be asked. And they are particularly weird to not be asked when rapport is there. People that have rapport with you want straight talking. They want to be asked the question that and I know we're all here to discuss. So do make sure that you ask those questions. And there is nothing wrong with the occasional direct question. They do need to be asked. More than 3 in a row? Agreed. More than 3 direct questions in a row is problematic. But when you're in the room and we're talking, ask the question. And so finally on to tip 10, which is what we call paint the picture and leave it to dry. What we've noticed when we're training is that most of the students that we train are very interesting to talk to, very conversational, very naturalistic, very engaged. And yet then when they go into the interview room, they become very sanitized, very antiseptic, very robotic, very clinical. And that's particularly weird when we're talking about things which are potentially traumatic or grave or horrific or grim. And whilst it's obviously not appropriate to kind of salaciously be graphic about what we're dealing with, and certainly not in a judgmental way, oh, this was so horrific because such and such a thing happened. We're not suggesting that. But nonetheless, you want to be able to use more human language to describe the reality of what it is that we are there to talk about. And if that is death or sexual abuse or physical abuse or mental abuse or whatever it is, just paint a realistic picture of what it is that you are dealing with as a police team. And don't shy away from it. Don't sanitize it. Don't use words that soften it. Don't use words that ramp it up either, but just be real. Paint a picture and leave it to dry. And what we mean by that is that, you know, use authentic human language to describe what it is that we're all here to talk about. But that is not to say that you are assuming or indicating that the person that you have used that language with is guilty or even necessarily has anything to do with it. But just be real about the language so that they can visualize what it is that we're here to talk about. And then let that sit and let them contemplate whether they want to answer questions about it. You have a duty to describe in an authentic and realistic way what it is that we're here to talk about and not shy away from it. And I think some interviewers are reticent, again, perhaps because of the fear of breaking down the communication. But if you think about it yourself and you were a suspect and you were involved in a police interview, but not involved in the case at all, you had absolutely nothing to do with it, you still want to know what it is that you are being suspected of, and you want to be given it straight rather than kind of in this very circuitous or antiseptic way. So, final tip, paint the picture and leave it to dry.